In this video, we're going to review Jeju Air Flight 2216, which tragically crashed 12 days ago in South Korea, claiming the lives of 179 passengers and crew. And we're going to look closely at what we know about pilot decision-making and pilot mental frameworks leading up to that accident. G'day, welcome back to the channel on this sad occasion. My name is Matthew Dank. I'm a former Australian Navy and Australian Air Force pilot, having served my career flying H-60 Seahawk helicopters and Globemaster heavy jet transport aircraft. I also instructed in the C-17 simulator for Air Force pilots for a period before taking a break and getting back to flying on the 737 MAX 8 just 12 months ago. Today we're going to examine this unfortunate incident that's occurred just recently in South Korea, and we're going to take a look at what we do know about pilot decision making, and we're going to glean some insights as far as we can, noting that the accident report and even the cockpit voice recorder transcript are not yet available. So if you're watching my channel, I'll take it that you are an aviation enthusiast or an aviator yourself, so I'll keep the overview quite brief. Jeju Air Flight 2216, 29 December 2024. It was a roughly 5-hour flight from Bangkok to Muan, South Korea, flying a Boeing 737-800 next generation. A bird strike has been confirmed as occurring on approach to runway 01. The aircraft then made an approach to the opposite runway, runway 19, and overran, impacting a concrete and earth wall housing the localizer antenna. This resulted in the life of 179 people on board, with only 2 survivors being those situated in the tail of the aircraft. For sure, you've seen some very confronting imagery of the accident by now, and plenty of commentary about that concrete wall. Why was it there? It might have been compliant, but it certainly did not help in this situation, and it was a major factor in the end result. You'll have also seen the pattern that the aircraft followed from approach to runway 01, made a call about 8:59 local, and then a landing just 2 minutes after that, followed by the impact with the concrete wall. An extremely urgent landing, I would suggest, and a lot of questions there as to why checklists couldn't be run, why some flap and gear couldn't be deployed to help the aircraft situation on the runway. So stepping up a level, we're going to take a look today at some of the insights we can glean from that approach and what that tells us about likely pilot decision making. Now, we do not know the full facts, so we're going to avoid wild speculation. We're going to look at likely decision-making frames and what we can learn from that, given our general aviation knowledge. It's also important to consider the bigger picture here. The crash voice recorder has been transcribed, I have been informed, and the South Korean authorities have a view to releasing that in the next couple of days into the next few weeks. They're believing that the full accident report could be many months, even years away. So it will be important for airlines and particularly 737 operators to take a close look at that transcript and to learn what they can, noting South Korean authorities have mandated inspections of domestic 737 aircraft. It's also important to look at this situation beyond just pilot decision making. Now, due to the outcome of this accident, due to the amount of lives lost, there will be very close scrutiny of pilots, and very rarely have any of us had a flight where there's been no errors whatsoever. So they will be closely scrutinized, and they should be closely scrutinized. However, it's important to look at not just the pilot performance themselves, but the systems which support the pilots. The check and training system, the fatigue rest, the scheduling system, and a range of other things that go into pilot performance and that support us so we can get the most out of our flying and hopefully complete flights quite safely. There'll also be a close look and a lot of attention paid to contributing factors. So any other issues or incidents that might have arisen and that may have contributed to this, including the mechanical state of the aircraft, the weather, the background of both pilots, the runway environment, ATC at the destination airport, and so on. There are many factors that will be carefully analysed. In this video today, we're looking at one factor in particular, and that is aircrew decision making and aircrew performance. And the reference standard for that in terms of how we are training airline pilots in the industry in 2024 is really based on evidence and competency-based training, which here articulated by EASA in Europe outlines a range of behaviours that airline operators and on measurable competencies that crews need to display when dealing with normal operations and non-normal operations and emergencies. So we can see here a number of behaviours: leadership, teamwork, problem solving, decision making, etc. And the key thing to note, they don't relate to specific technical tasks. For example, there's nothing in here about how to land an aircraft. There's nothing here about running a checklist, how to do that technically. Nothing here about how to start or shut down an engine. It is the behaviours and the thought processes and the execution of core skills, which are known really as non-technical skills. If we look now at the EASA safety material for the evidence-based and competency-based training, and this is a standard I was trained under about 12 months ago when doing my 737 MAX 8 type rating at Gatwick, London. We can see here why these rules are being applied. It talks about aircraft design reliability being improved steadily over a significant amount of time, with aircraft now being highly reliable. However, it's still impossible to foresee all plausible accident scenarios, especially in today's aviation system where its complexity and high reliability mean that the next accident may be something completely unexpected. The logic here is that the human factor is now the biggest factor in accidents that occur, and aircraft reliability themselves and the systems are very well known and very, very reliable. In terms of training itself, they've defined a possible solution to improve flight training would be to focus on competencies instead of pre-described flight maneuvers, many of those being non-technical. Meaning, if we go back to the slide here, we're looking at the competencies and the behaviours, all of which really, except for flight path management automation and flight path management manual, are non-technical skills. So formerly known as soft skills, behaviours, thought processes, and skills that don't relate to technically flying the airplane. Importantly here, the document states that this aims to create more resilient flight crews that are more prepared to handle operational events instead of scripted and sometimes predictable scenarios currently used in training. So contemporary airline pilot training is largely based on regular simulator training sessions, and that can be either quarterly or in some operations biannually, so every 6 months, where pilots will come in, they'll go through a set amount of emergency scenarios and sequences, and they'll be expected to perform against those. So this can be a situation where these training sequences become scripted, they become repetitive, and they don't look at broader, less likely and more difficult challenges that pilots might have to face. However, the intention here from EASA is to look at the behaviours themselves underlying the performance and make sure they're being consistently and evenly applied across all operations. Okay, again, here is the 8 different behaviours, and I would suggest for today's video and what we're looking at with Jeju Air 2216, leadership teamwork, problem solving and decision making, and workload management will feature highly. So let's take a look in particular at decision making. Let's take a look at particular the subset skills that would be applied under this, and we can have a think about what we know about Jeju Air 2216 and how these might map. The first is that the crew will identify, assess and manage threats and errors in a timely manner. This would include potential bird strikes as a threat. This would include potentially making wrong decisions or moving too rapidly through emergency sequence as a threat, and also capturing any errors that the crew have made. It also talks about, under 6.3, identifying and verifying what and why things have gone wrong if appropriate. So really delving into the root cause behind any malfunctions in the time available, and identifying and understanding the need and the reason before this. And it states specifically here on the rightmost column that the reasons for an engine failure are analysed after abnormal procedures have been completed, which would be standard practice, and noting this would take some amount of time to complete. 6.5 talks about identifying and considering appropriate options. So diversion airports, choice of runway. This again takes time to think through and to make the correct decision. 6.6 talks about applying appropriate and timely decision-making techniques. So natural decision-making, which is highly experience-based. Rational, so going through options and assessing them. Pattern recognition, so assessing between familiar options and other decision-making methods. So really being quite conscious of that decision-making process being used. And lastly, 6.8 adapts when faced with situations where no guidance or procedure exists. And this may well be the sort of decision-making that was used in the actual incident, as it was a rapid approach, and it appears a lot of standard procedures and a lot of non-normal procedures that would normally be used and leveraged were dispensed with for one reason or another. Okay, we're going to take a look at the decision sequence that would have been used, or that is indicated by the flight path of the aircraft, noting that we do not have the cockpit voice recorder at this point in time. We do not have indication of what malfunctions and exactly what decision-making processes the crews used. We're going to look first of all at the runway approach and touchdown. Then we'll take a look at the approach type and the urgency applied to getting the aircraft down onto runway 19. And lastly, the initial emergency handling and possible scenarios that may have led to this rapid approach. Okay, again here we've got the indication of the departure end of the runway, and the graphic video did indicate the aircraft was moving at quite a high speed when it crossed the departure end, potentially 150 knots or higher. You can see there that the ILS localizer was set up only 260 meters from the departure end of runway. However, this was compliant with standards required at the time. Where did the aircraft touch down? Okay, so as we'll see in a moment from the head-on video with the flare and landing, the touchdown was approximately 1,200 meters or 4,000 feet down the runway. Now this is over twice the distance that would normally be expected for a safe approach and touchdown, including air distance to get the wheels on the runway. The remaining runway was roughly 1,600 meters or 5,200 feet, which even at the best of times, as we'll see in a moment, would have made for a very tight stop with normal systems operating. Okay, here's the head-on camera footage of the aircraft approaching the runway with no flaps deployed and with gear up. Approaching the runway, approximately crossing the threshold here and going for an extended flare before the aircraft eventually settles on the runway. So a few things are notable here, one being that the aircraft appears to at least have some power available. It appears to be making a powered approach and a relatively gentle flare above the runway, and then just the duration of the flare, which looks to be in excess of 10 seconds, possibly up towards 14 seconds. For comparison and to provide a bit of data around this, I've presented here the non-normal configuration landing distance checklist. So this is a flight manual checklist for the 737 MAX 8. So not the same 737 variant, but it gives an indication of the stopping performance of a more modern 737 and how difficult it would have been to stop with no flaps. The data here is for no flaps and gear down, and I do note that the Jeju Air aircraft had gear up, so even less stopping potential. So this is a guide only. Now, if we look at the top left, we've got all flaps up landing VREF 40 plus 55. This means that the landing speed with flaps 40, we would apply that and add 55 knots. So you're looking at an approach speed and landing speed of roughly 190 to 200 knots, so very fast. Standard landing weight here around 65,000 tonne can be assumed. And if we go down to the left there, auto brake 2 is indicative of a low level of braking, so the lowest auto brake setting that we can use. And if that was the case, you can see the landing distance, including a 7-second flare. So from the very start of the runway to when the aircraft came to a full stop would be about 3,500 meters or 11,600 feet. So this would be grossly exceeding the 9,200 available on the particular runway. For maximum braking, so maximum heavy braking, you're looking at 1,725 meters or 5,600 feet. It is very doubtful, given the rate at which the aircraft set up for the immediate landing, that time was available for the crew to review this data and to check their landing performance. And the point worth making here is that landing without any gear whatsoever would have provided even less stopping performance and even less deceleration than what's indicated here. So the 11,600 feet under light braking would likely to have been even more. And that goes some way to explaining just why the aircraft departed the departure end of the runway on the right at such a high rate of speed. It would have been nearly impossible, in my view, to stop in the runway available, particularly given how late down the runway the aircraft touched down. So it does appear that as soon as the aircraft had committed to landing and actually touched down 1,200 meters down the runway, that the fate of the crew and the passengers was sadly assured. So let's now look at the approach pattern flown and the time available to set up for and prepare for the landing. Okay, this diagram gives an indication of the time at which the emergency was declared on final for runway 01 at 8:59, and then the decision to turn left and join a right downwind or right traffic pattern to land runway 19. You can see that just 2 minutes later the aircraft was at the top of the pattern ready to turn right to the south, and 1 minute after that had landed on the runway. So very tight indeed. If we take a look at this diagram from flightsafety.org, which admittedly is quite cluttered, it does show the point at which ADS-B data was cut off at the very right of the graph there, just beyond the 6 figure. And it does indicate at that point in time the aircraft was at approximately 500 feet, 155 knots. Just prior to that, between figure 4 and figure 5, at 8 minutes 58 and 30 seconds, it appears that a rate of climb was instigated, potentially to avoid birds or something else. We can also see there at figure 6 that the aircraft was just 1.1 miles from the runway, so on final, potentially a little bit high, but certainly looking to land on runway 01. This chart and diagram shows, again, a slight deviation in the flight path, potentially looking to avoid birds there, and the last publicly known data point. So at about 8:59, just before the aircraft diverted to the left. So very much late in the approach, very much in a position from which the aircraft could have landed on runway 01. However, that did not occur, and the crew elected to make a left turn to join a right pattern. So it's presumed that any emergency occurred prior to that emergency call and prior to that turn to the left, with any actions carried out prior to then, and then the decision made to turn left and join the right downwind. You can see that amount of time there between 8:59 and 9:01 is just 2 minutes, so extremely condensed time period to conduct checks, to conduct gear extension, flaps extension, and any briefings required. Less than 2 minutes to do all of that whilst manually flying the aircraft, presumably for an approach that no one had expected. Top right of the diagram there, after 9:01 a.m, the crew would have been largely focused on their approach and landing, so there would have been very little time to run any administration whatsoever. So this traffic pattern in this right downwind is consistent with a very, very fast and highly urgent approach and arrival. The question remains, what might have caused this? What might have led to the situation where the crew decided they needed to be on the ground just that quickly? There has been discussion about whether potentially the left engine, the good operating engine, was shut down or was manipulated, and whether this gave crew cause to expedite the approach and landing. Following any bird strike incident, there was likely a period of startle or surprise. This is a period of about 10 to 15 seconds following a surprise incident, like impacting a flock of birds, that the pilots would have been basically physiologically responding to the incident. So they wouldn't have been able to process and respond and understand exactly what happened for 10 to 15 seconds, after which they would have looked to confirm what the malfunction was and certainly confirm the correct engine before making any manipulation. This does take time, and this is normally done in a very measured way to make sure that the correct malfunction is being addressed and the correct engine is being manipulated if it does require shutdown or other actions. So this leads to a discussion and a consideration of what potentially may have led to the rapid decision to land. One potential option would be a severe uncontained fire in the aircraft, where the crew would have assessed the risk of that fire greater than the risk of making a rapid and unbriefed landing. Another would have been a loss of thrust on both engines, where there would have been no choice but to make an immediate landing. And the third, multiple cascading system failures. So a series of interrelated failures that were time critical or judged as such by the pilots, requiring immediate landing. Looking at these and looking at the data here, in terms of the aircraft altitude being 500 feet, 1 mile south of runway 01, it is practically impossible for the aircraft to proceed without power and land on runway 19, flying the traffic pattern the aircraft proceeded on. So it is very much likely that there was thrust at least on one engine, at least partially, to enable that pattern to be flown and enable the approach and flare that we saw on the earlier video. The question remains, what was the failure on board the aircraft, and why did the crew assess that an immediate landing without gear and without flaps was required? So what can we learn from this tragic accident that claimed so many lives? Firstly, we just don't know what caused this accident. We do not know exactly what the crew was reacting to and whether their performance was as best one could imagine or whether it had major flaws. We'll only know that with the release of at least the cockpit voice recorder and then the interim accident report to follow. That will allow the question to be addressed: were there any other options? Was more time available? Could the aircraft have been configured with gear and or flap at a minimum? Beyond this, airlines and 737 operators are certainly to be looking at their own training systems, looking at the competency standards and the behaviours expected of their pilots, and pilots globally will be looking at this to see how they would have responded in the same situation by taking the view that this could happen to any of us and no one is superhuman or immune to errors. We do need to approach every flight with the utmost professionalism, ready for really any eventuality and any consequence, which is a major weight to carry, but that's part of being a professional pilot. And importantly, beyond that, we need to look at just not pilot decision making, but the support system, the training, checking, standards, fatigue rest, and everything else involved in supporting professional pilots to get the job done and ensuring they can perform just how they need to, just when they need to. So that's it for the video today. Thank you for joining me. I hope you found it insightful and informative. And if you've got any comments or thoughts on how we can make aviation safer and how we can lift pilot performance, please let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in a future video.